медіаторами, з юристами, зрештою і з самою Ізда, завершилися таким успішним запровадженням, розробкою такого практичного інструменту, який ми називаємо українська Ізда або локальна українська Ізда. А якщо говорити офіційно, то це Українська генеральна угода для позабіржових деривативних контрактів, яка базується на генеральній угоді Ізда. Ми сьогодні працюємо за таким регламентом. Спочатку у нас буде вступне слово про те, як все відбувалося, чому це важливо і які права інтелектуальної власності було передано.
And we discussed the transfer of intellectual rights, and Robert Bond, who is in charge of the USAID project, transforming the market. Peter Werner of Isda, Maria Kaleganova, Deputy Executive Director of the Independent Association of Ukraine, Igor Olekhov, Co-Chair of the Committee of the Chamber on Banking and Financial Service, representing Chamber of Commerce of the U.S. So 5 minutes per speech, please, and then we're going to move on to the main part. Dmytro Pshenychniuk, Kinstellar advisor, will speak. He represents a law firm which drafted the paperwork, and he will do a short presentation, and following that, we're going to be more than happy to get comments, feedback, further plans, implementation plans. So we're going to have it from regulators Yaroslav, Shliakhov, member of the Stock Market and Securities Commission, Mykola Selekhman, Deputy Chair of the Open Markets Department, representing the NBU. And market participants, market players, we appreciate their active involvement in the working group as they review the documents. Tetyana Popovych, Director of Capital Markets, AT Alfa Bank. Anton Kovalenko, Director of Treasury Department and Financial Institutions of AT OTB Bank. So I'm turning over to Robert Bond, who runs the USAID project, Transformation of Financial Sector.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. In Ukraine, the derivatives market is predominantly an over-the-counter market. Businesses use derivatives to hedge foreign exchange risks and price fluctuations. However, these are products, and it takes time and effort to negotiate the agreement. Standardization allows counterparty work of a previously agreed. This mitigates legal risk and determines obligation. Using the Isda Master Agreement to define only certain features of the transaction. General provisions are set out. This is what we are presenting here today. A lot of people think derivatives are some mythical beast. Simple. Comes from the underlying that, not the legal contract. See, when you trade derivatives, this was a project that took about a year for us to develop. We worked with the Association of Ukrainian and the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. And we also work very closely with the banks and law firms and investment companies. So this activity started in October. We did a survey of member interest of the different associations in using derivative products. And we found that there was a great deal of interest, especially in foreign exchange and interest rate derivatives. The FST project then engaged a law firm, Kinstellar, to draft the initial documentation in January 2021. After that, in April, we took the drafts to a working group and a broader audience for review and comment. And then over the summer, we finalized the documentation for foreign exchange, interest rates, and derivatives for commodities, meaning agro and base metals and diesel. I want to thank all the associations for their contributions and those of their members. I also want to thank the International Swaps and Derivatives Association for its cooperation and guidance in developing the documentation. And I, of course, would like to thank Kinstellar for their excellent work in defining the master agreement document. Thank you.
Дякую, Роберт. Передаю слово Пітеру Вернеру, старшому раднику міжнародної
Thank you, Robert. Over to Peter Werner, the senior advisor of Isda.
Thanks very
Peter
much.
shares
Can you
a
hear
lot
me
of
okay?
useful stuff with us.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the chance to participate in today's event here from London. I hope to be able to show up in person one fine day again in Kiev. Isda is delighted to see yet another jurisdiction publish a localized version of the Isda Master Agreement for domestic transactions. This continues the trend worldwide to closely align local law and language documentation with global standards that are used in cross-border transaction. The Ukraine is the latest jurisdiction to do so. It's great to see that the USAID-funded project culminate in the publication of the new Ukrainian Master Agreement, as described by Robert just now, and physically shown as well. Isda is looking forward to continuing the cooperation with USAID and the national associations regarding the new document, also in order to maintain the local master agreement in light of future development, both at global as well as national level. We'll have to do that over the next couple of years. Our cooperation here at ISDA with both USAID and the co-publishing local associations has been excellent from day one. And we appreciate the transparent discussions throughout the drafting process, including with Counsel and the working group. Also, as a jurisdiction, generally, Ukraine will remain high on the ISDA agenda going forward. And as said, the same applies to the financial industry and also the energy industry as a whole. From ISDA's perspective, we intend to publish eventually a netting opinion. That's the big aim, the next aim. To that effect, we are involved currently in discussions under the aegis of the national regulators and EBRD to address a few remaining issues across various pieces of legislation that need to be addressed. So let me conclude by congratulating again USAID and the national associations on the publication of the Ukrainian Master Agreement. And we are looking forward to continuing the cooperation going forward. Many thanks.
Дякуємо Пітеру за важливу підтримку в процесі.
Thank you, Peter, for this important support in the process, and thanks for sharing international experience with us all the time. And that's where it's at right now. I'm turning over to people representing two associations who got the intellectual property rights from ISDA under the licensing agreement. And further on, they will be translating all of this into life, keeping this agreement up to date. Maria Kolganova, Deputy Executive Director of NABU, and Igor Olekhov, Co-Chair of the Committee of the Chamber of the U.S. Chamber of Industry and Commerce. So, Maria? Hello, everybody. I'll be brief. So, first off, As NABU, I would like to say that we appreciate the USAID-led project, ISDA, and colleagues from the Business Association. Together, we have been able to come up with this product. It took involvement of everybody, and we came up with the standard set of documents for the Ukrainian market. It matters to us. We all can see that legislation in the sector is evolving intensely, and some Ukrainian banks are already using OTC derivatives, but it's not a common practice in the market as a whole. Most banks and players in the financial market and their clients still believe that derivatives are something very exotic and complicated, something hard to get. But we're absolutely sure that standard documentation and this centralized approach will make it easier to make derivative contracts even for the new users. And that approach should expand the market. The market is expected to grow, and this will allow the market to grow bigger, involving customers, and banks and other players will discover new ways of managing risks and earning profits. So as you can see, all of these positive developments are out there as the project has been implemented and master agreement signed. All of that is done to help the economy do better. It should discover an extra potential for growth. So there is no need to be afraid of derivatives. Thanks to these joint efforts, we're going to help this country do everything right. We're going to involve more participants. So I'd like to thank all of the counterparts and partners in this. I appreciate this two-way communication and collaboration. So this presentation will be quite an eye-opener to other participants who have been unaware of the project so far. So maybe you will pick up a lot of interest and insights here.
Дякую, Ігоре.
Thank you. So over to Igor now. Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'm happy to welcome everybody on behalf of the American Chamber of Industry and Commerce. I'd like to just say a few words about the local developments and the way the Chamber sees it. I'd like to thank the USAID-led financial transformation projects for supporting members of the Chamber and other market players in drafting the local version of this. And I guess this is something that's going to be quite an impetus in developing OTC derivatives in this country, and it will lay foundations for the future of this market, which will be standardized and unified, allowing banks and corporate clients and state-run institutions and companies to develop and do a lot better things. As an association, we have been happy to be a part of drafting this document, this product. We produced our comments and feedback in the process of doing that. As an association, we have long been talking about the need to use more instruments, and those instruments, tools should be made available to the Ukrainian players in the financial market. We have actively worked the efforts to pass the Law 738, which stimulates investments and extends the circle of financial tools. It outlines the key concepts like liquidation netting. It tells us what is the standard master agreement. And according to that, we have been able to produce the paperwork we're presenting today. And a tremendous work has been done by all market players. The idea was to set up a tool set which in future would be used by everybody in the market, and we came closer to the civilized financial market in terms of OTC derivatives. And this master agreement attains many objectives which were mentioned in the Law 728, which was passed last year and took effect earlier this year. So all in all, it will make for certainty in the markets of financial tools, and we are expecting other tools to be in business, and there is a growing interest in that from the business players and from the players in the markets of particular commodities. So that will be the foundation for shaping up those new markets. I'm speaking of the derivatives for exchange rate changes and interest rate changes in natural gas prices, electricity rates, and so on. OTC derivatives, all in all, allow the market players to see the future and be certain about that. And this is something that has been missing in the Ukrainian market all the time. Hopefully, these tools will become one of the key factors which would allow the Ukrainian businesses to see the future in spite of volatility and changes that are happening all the time. Now there seems to be a tool in place that allows them to gain more certainty in this entire situation. And we're not going to stop working on these tools. The master agreement is like a backbone for developing other instruments, further instruments. In order for this market to pick up, we will need to do more steps in order to consolidate practices, in order to improve the existing paperwork. Also, we're going to need to produce annexes to that, addressing particular markets and particular products offered by banks and financial institutions, as well as corporate clients. So the Chamber will keep supporting this initiative together with the colleagues, and that's how this market will move on, and over time it should become competitive vis-a-vis local players, but also internationally. Thank you. Thank you, Igor, and I appreciate your active involvement in the process. So with this, we're into the fun part now. So it's going to be the presentation of the master agreement. And I'm happy to turn over to Dmytro Pshenychniuk from Kinstellar. Well, it's hard to find a lawyer in this country who knows more about the local version of the master agreement of Isda than Dmytro, because he has gone through this entire process from the very outset. And no matter how complicated it has been, we have been able to make it there. So Dmytro, you're welcome to speak now. We've got about 90 participants following this online. So I hope you're going to be able to basically explain to us the things about derivatives, the master agreement, in simple, plain words, just to give everybody the idea. All right, thank you, Yulia, for this event. We were a part of the working group. I represent Kinstellar, and we could see that it took quite an effort to make a pool of interested parties from different markets, big corporates, investment banks, small banks, and so on. A lot of organizational work had to be done. And it was an important step in order to make an effective and safe documentation, and that was great. It took about 6 months in order to complete that part, and it's quite a short time for doing something that big. And I pretty much appreciate the collaboration between the USAID and business associations and bankers and the regulators. There have been 2 regulators and the Stock Market and Securities Commission and the National Bank. Over these 7 months, we have presented to the market a consolidated stance on how derivative documentation should look like in the OTC markets, where an investment company makes a transaction with a client or a bank, does it with another bank. So it happens outside the exchange. Structurally, this paperwork will resemble the best ISDA products and best practices. It includes the master agreement. The master agreement is like a framework agreement covering all derivatives that are found in transactions between the parties. In the advanced market, these derivatives portfolios can be huge, like more than 1,000. In local realities, we can see that banks will have certain derivatives portfolios, and it's going to be regulated by the master framework agreement. Speaking of this agreement, it has been established under the Ukrainian law, and it embodies the best concepts of ISDA that have been implemented on both sides of the ocean, and that's what is underpinning the existing market of derivatives. This discussion has seen involvement from the leading law firms and investment banks and bankers themselves and legal units of banks. We believe that this consolidated view is very important to help this market pick up. The master agreement is the strong foundation for derivatives, and each transaction done by a bank or a counterparty will be confirmed. It's like a confirmation document that is used by ISDA across the globe, across all financial sectors and centers. And the same confirmations can be received by Ukrainian companies and banks now. The confirmation outlines the key conditions of derivatives, economic conditions, and together with the master agreement, it's going to be recognized as one single agreement. Also, the project sought to make a reform of legislation on collateral, and effectively we would come up with a non-typical collateral based on transfer of rights. And I guess inside the working group we have been able to make a margin agreement which is of interest to banks. So that paperwork features 3 booklets like standard set of conditions which regulate certain types of derivatives: hard currency derivatives, hard currency interest rate derivatives, and commodity mercantile derivatives. So without taking much more of your time, I'd like to say that it is important to understand the time limits we had in order to produce this paperwork in this country. In summer, the liquidation netting took effect in this country, and Ukraine appeared on the map of liquidation netting of the world. And this time we can say that we've got the documentation that we discussed with the market and regulators. Now it should possibly be implemented, used by the market players. So we appreciate the associations involved in that and our clients, customers. Eventually, we have been able to create a mechanism that allows to update this documentation in order to match the market needs the best possible way. Thank you, Dmitry. It's been a very concise overview of the tremendous amount of work that has been done. With this, I'd like to turn over to the regulators, the National Securities and Stock Market Commission, National Bank, and I'd like to explain to you briefly why is it so important to keep regulators involved. Derivatives are a contract which is made for a particular period of time, but within that period, something might happen to one of the counterparties, and then the contract will not be honored. So in all countries, these contracts are regulated very thoroughly and monitored thoroughly. And we've got a law on capital markets 738, which was passed, and it envisions the possibility of making a master agreement for OTC derivatives, but also it envisions the powers and involvement of regulators in the process. It's a very limited involvement compared to the exchange-based tools, but still, The regulators can see the entire market and they have certain ways of influencing things. So I'm curious to see what regulators are thinking about that. Yaroslav Shliakhov, member of the Securities Commission. Thank you. So speaking for the regulators, I can tell you that certain amount of work has been done, and it's been quite an effort to produce the paperwork and make it match the international practices and Ukrainian law. And it's been quite a contribution to further development of the market. The regulator is supportive of this effort, and we indicated the standards that should be there, and they're mandatory, that should be in agreements of this kind. It is important to understand that the market is supposed to determine the principles by which it will be functioning, and Ukraine is joining these principles now. It means that the country is mature enough, it understands the point, it gets the point, it's ready to fully implement these principles. I'm certain that it's going to be quite a significant contribution to the development of the system. Derivatives market right now is the market of very high demand across the world, so the regulators will only be supportive of the progress this market is making in future. Okay, Mykola, Selekhman, representing the National Bank of Ukraine. Is he with us?
Ми будемо тоді продовжувати далі. Якщо Микола ще приєднається, то ми дамо...
Okay, let's carry on. Once he joins us, we're going to have it from him. So, actually, with this, we're moving on to the assessment of all of these. So we're going to hear comments from the market players because they're going to have to be using these tools. We're speaking of these contractual mechanisms, which are kind of untypical for the continental law. This master agreement is like a new development for this country. But the advantages are the following. As Yaroslav suggested, it carries principles. It is something the players have agreed to, like the common rules that will be working under. So we would like to see what the practitioners are thinking about that. Tetyana Popovych, Director of Capital Markets, representing Alfa Bank. Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity. I represent a large commercial bank and also represent NABU, and I co-chair the committee of the U.S. Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Banking and Financial Services. So we speak with large and medium-sized clients and even individuals. And every time we can see a growing need for clients to be able to make derivative transactions. There was a question earlier on. It looks like a niche product, and who are the takers? I can tell you in simple words as a practitioner that derivatives and hedging are a kind of insurance when everything is in turbulence. You can see lots of fluctuations in the FX and prices. Globally across the market, we can see a growing volatility. This country is exports oriented. So in this setting, it is important to be hedged at least partly for the future in terms of price of your product, of your commodity, and also is going to be a currency insurance in case the exchange rate changes. So this tool is there for this purpose, and it can well be used in this situation. Now that the banks are allowed to do that, so the law was changed and the National Bank allowed for that to happen, and the banks began offering these tools over some time. But they do it based on their own existing agreements. So all financial institutions in this country very often work with the same clients, and they offer their agreements. Those are like working tools, but it cannot be scaled across the whole market. It cannot be implemented everywhere because there is no standardized practice. The association did their part of the job, and we have seen so many questions from corporate clients. So much misunderstanding was indicated. They were so interested in these tools, and we were surprised to see that this cause is very important, and we indeed appreciate the organizations that began doing something about that. So ISDA and its practices have been very much considered in this market over quite some time. We took part in the discussions in various working groups here and there, but at this time, USAID took care of things and our fellow colleagues, lawyers and associations. And over these months, they have created a product which is in line with the international standards, something that can work in this country. It's a very viable tool. It's not something that has been generated by a particular financial institution. Maybe a financial institution could make a good product, but if it's something standardized, then it can be implemented market-wide. It's not the end of the story. There is yet quite a lot of work to do. The legislation is getting liberalized, especially hard currency legislation, and there is a lot to be done about that. Hopefully, they're going to liberalize the commodity derivatives so that you would get commodity hedging in this country. And based on the global international experience we've got, we're going to be more than happy working with everybody else. So we need to improve liquidation netting within the Ukrainian law. And then, as liberalization continues, we'll work with the Commission and the National Bank, and over time we're going to see the need to adapt Ukrainian ISDA to the new challenges in the legislation and in the market. So once again, the point I'm trying to make is this. This work began quite a while ago, and now it has paid off. It has been completed at a certain stage. We've got 15 years of experience in the international market, and we contributed some of our experience to this product, to this successful launch, and let's keep moving on. Let's not stop. All right, thank you, Tetyana, for this good explanation of business logic and the positive outlooks for the future. They're telling me that Mykola Selekhman, representing the National Bank, is back with us again. So let's have it from him. Hello, dear colleagues. I've been with you, but somehow my microphone never worked. All righty, so we appreciate our sponsors. After a few years of discussions, well, you all know that we wanted to have some kind of local SDA, and I think those discussions were around for like a decade or so, but nobody would do a thing. But this time changes did happen, and within a pretty short time, like half a year, that's nothing, you know, time-wise, when it comes to drafting an agreement. Making ISDA contract with a counterpart might take half a year in order to take care of all of the things. Plus you get some red tape to go through, but half a year is like a record time that you have spent creating an agreement. So I really appreciate this product. And from our side, I can say we support this movement towards establishing an OTC market of derivatives. without an appropriate contract, it's very hard to make it happen. There is a risk that a counterparty fails to honor the contract, and then this agreement really matters. In our transactions that we do with banks, well, banks may believe that the national bank will always do what it takes, so we might choose something built in-house. It's not a professionally built product. But without a master agreement like that, this thing will not last long. So we're happy to see that there is a contract like that. Well, I hope it's out there. And then the practice will show how it actually works. And it is important that banks sign these agreements with each other. They should not start with big volumes in the beginning, so they can work with their clients trying to do it. As one of the presenters suggested earlier, we will see how it goes, and then as we keep practicing it, we're going to see what's not working well, and we'll be able to make it work better. You cannot make everything ideal from the very outset, but little by little, as we keep using that in practice, we're going to be able to improve it. I also can say that we're always supportive of the derivatives, and it's not just talk, we're doing something to make it happen. And this time, they are presenting the new agreement for the local market, and tomorrow we have one of the last scheduled auctions. It's not going to happen under this agreement, but still, that's another reason why we should abandon some built products and move on to something standardized for the entire market. If banks start making contracts like that with each other, they're going to be able to do things in this OTC market of derivatives, and maybe then we're going to go back to this market, and based on this agreement, we're going to be able to do more. Well, what else? Godspeed to you. So let's keep on it. Let's give it a try, give it a whirl. Derivatives can be structured. They can be of different kinds. This product might carry a little credit risk, like RS or forward. It's not much of a credit risk there typically. So all in all, I guess we can go ahead and try and make certain transactions like this. If anything, the risks are not as big as those related to the loans and credits that you issue. So let's go ahead and use that in your activity, your work, and we're going to be doing that too. All right, thank you so much. It's been an encouraging statement from the National Bank. Appreciate that. So I'd like to turn over to Anton Kovalenko, ATP Bank. Same question to you. How do you see some practical implementation of this? What are the pilot stages that you might think of in implementing ISDA in the Ukrainian setting? Hello. I'd like to begin by saying that I appreciate everybody who took part in developing this product, who initiated it in this country. And here is why. We have been trying to come up with the Ukrainian derivative over many years. It was like trying to reinvent the wheel. But this time we stopped doing that. And in the capital of markets, we haven't been able to reinvent a good wheel. So from now on, we're going to spend our energy on something else. It's not about reinventing something. It's about learning to rightly apply something that is already there, because in this document you get the provisions we haven't thought about. Maybe some colleagues have seen that in practice, but previously I haven't heard of the calculation agent or things like that, but I can see this in this agreement. In our tools, we never had so much detail on day offs, defaults. We all would do it in our own way. But this time we have some materials made by professionals and also clients, like financial professionals and corporate business clients, transnationals, multinationals. Will be able to make derivatives contracts with us a lot more easily. To me, that's a great benefit, because if you show them what you have put together, and they are a big corporation, so it takes a long time to come to terms with them. Now we can refer to something that has been recognized by everybody, and that will speed up the negotiations. And because of the liquidation netting that this document sets out, we can spell out particular limits that were used under the old contracts. ISDA will not be a magic wand for the derivatives market to grow, but it's a good, rock-solid foundation which will contribute to the further progress of the Ukrainian market. Thank you. Thank you, Anton. So in a while, a few years down the road, we will see how it's going to pan out and what else should be done to keep it going the same way. We know that there is a need to make some legislative changes about liquidation netting and a few more things. And hopefully, the Securities Commission will take care of that. They will produce a draft law. And on this occasion, I'd like to make this point for the Commission. Certain proposed changes have been presented already, and they were consolidated in the process of this work, and they reached the Commission. So we're going to be expecting these changes to become a part of a draft law. And if need be, we're going to be around and we're going to be able to join that work in future. And with this, let's see if there are any questions. They come through the chat box or by raising a hand, or there might be questions from the folks that are with us in here right now. Oleg Bachun, Intersvit. There is pandemic in the world, so they speak about localized production. Ukraine is becoming a part of international cooperation clusters. Technical documentation is Ukrainian, spare parts come from China, the end result is in Europe. Is that something that could benefit Ukrainian businesses? Can Ukrainian intellectual property be used in such localized productions? And if we think of stakes are intellectual property too, but does that really match the concept you have outlined to us today? Maybe bankers could help us with that. I'm gonna try. Today's intellectual property of ours will not be very useful in those markets because they've got their own intellectual property. We're not the first country to make a local SDA, but this intellectual property will be helpful to you as Ukrainian producers when or if there is a need to hedge yourselves against the risks inherent in your operations. It can be commodity or a hard currency. You can offer a counterparty Ukrainian document, and I think it's bilingual, right? It's bilingual, Ukrainian English. Or you can get their documents, but in the Ukraine, you would have a cluster of law firms that will understand what document is that. When I receive a document from global banks, ISDA, I can see that we spend a lot of time looking through the paperwork, but this document will allow all of our legal experts to have a better idea. So there is a practical benefit that I can see. It's not a magic wand, it's not going to rescue us, but it's going to help anyway. I can tell you that in any exports case, there is some risk. And primarily, it's the risk of hard currency fluctuations. This is a standardized agreement, and it's right about that thing. So it allows you to do everything quickly and understandably inside the country and internationally. you can ensure a certain portion of your risk in terms of price or currency fluctuations. So as you become a part of something bigger, like a bigger community which exists internationally, where that agreement is used, that thing allows us to become a part of the international market. If it's hedging only still, it is something that can be done quickly and understandably. And in every financial institution, they will be able to get the point, they will be able to see what is done by the holder of intellectual property, importer or exporter. We have one more question from the audience here, then we're going to get some online. Interfax Ukraine, I am Natalia. Thank you for the presentation, but I have a question about the future outlook. So you've got this agreement out there now. It has been okayed by the market players, but what's going to be happening next? What else should be done to make it work? Under the existing practices, we can see that ISDA is a dynamic kind of paperwork. It keeps changing every time. Like you get negative interest rates, then you have to make special additions to the paperwork in order to account for that. Or you get new requirements from regulators in terms of margin. So that should be reflected in the transaction paperwork of the parties. We understand this. It's quite an understandable process. So we keep in touch with the partners, USAID, business associations, and we built a special mechanism whereby this paperwork will not be carved out in stone. It will be updated all the time depending on the challenges emerging. It may be something coming from the regulator or the market itself, from banks, from investment firms. The association members and associations themselves and the working group allow us to cover all of the clusters, big and small and medium-sized businesses, some corporate, big corporate clients, investment firms, banks. So that system allows us to hope that we're going to be able to quickly respond to any changes. And also you get global changes that are influencing things. The USAID came up with this paperwork working with ISDA closely, and hopefully ISDA will keep aiding us in terms of taking care of the regulatory changes, allowing us to pass new doctrines. So right now it's much easier to update this paperwork because we have the consolidated idea from the market, and then we will see what minor improvements are going to be necessary and what changes are happening, big changes are happening. This paperwork implements a lot of best practices that you get across the world, and that's quite a benefit because this documentation is something that allows local bankers and investment managers to enjoy the tools that are enjoyed by their colleagues elsewhere in this market across the world. As the bankers told us, it's like a golden standard. So we have a clear plan for updating this paperwork over time. And one more thing. While creating this standardized paperwork, we were guided by the principle that this paperwork can be adapted by parties or changed if there is a need to do so. If there is a risk of politics at the global level, or it's related to some Ukrainian branches of foreign banks, this paperwork allows to implement these peculiarities in it. So you can modify this paperwork to make it match your needs. So again, back to an answer to the question, we've got a mechanism that allows us to make these changes And the paperwork says that it can be modified if necessary. So that allows us to be optimistic. We keep in touch with the regulators, National Bank, Securities Commission, and there is like an agreement between us about how we're going to change in this paperwork and when. So there is like a plan for the nearest future. Okay. How are you going to interpret hard currency provisions in the contracts? It's a difference between formula and hard currency derivatives. I don't know, maybe somebody from the National Bank will be able to answer. Let me try and do that. We also receive letters with a question like that, and typically we say that it's a very generic question, so we cannot handle it. Well, certainly, it's a brand new product, and there is a big advantage that it carries right now. So starting 2019, there has been a change in the hard currency regulation. Before 2019, everything that is not allowed would be prohibited, and then everything you could do was something that is allowed. Now the concept is different from since then, and now you can do whatever that is not prohibited by law. So this time we're dealing with new products, and they're not prohibited because they have never been around. So in most cases, the National Bank will say there is no ban, so go ahead and do that. So right now, only some basic things have been prohibited, like forward contracts to buy foreign currency. That's not, well, I would not say it's a banned practice. If you're a resident, you can do it for a certain reason. If you're a non-resident, you cannot do it at all. Whatever is not a forward contract for that is allowed. So if there is no particular ban, you can do it. If we see some abuse and if we see somebody trying to make it look like derivatives and in fact they're going to buy hard currency without commitments, well, then we're going to try and step in and see what we can do about that. At least we're going to impose some limits, restrictions. But right now, I guess the benefit is clear. It's a new product. It's not banned or prohibited. You can give it a whirl. So if you are going to give it a whirl, then please check with us, and we're going to give you a month or so, and you will get a response and answer from us. And you will see if your contract is legit, if it's acceptable. That's a very generic question, and I try to be specific, but I'm not sure that I got the gist of the question. All right, so there was a raised hand in the chat from Oleg. Thank you. I'd like to ask a question of Peter Werner, representing ISDA. So, how will the OTC derivatives market will change, and what can we expect in the Ukrainian market in particular? Well, based on the experience working in other countries that made local ISDA agreements, so Peter, what could you tell me about that?
Thanks, Igor, for that question. Yeah, hard to generalize, but I would say that in general the volumes have increased significantly because of the facilitation that standard documentation provides. So most recently, jurisdictions which have gone down this route that I touched on earlier include Romania, Georgia, Malaysia for Islamic derivatives transactions, etc. And there, from what we hear anecdotally, we don't have formal surveys on this yet. Volumes have increased significantly, so that's one element. So in whatever the initial type of transaction per jurisdiction is the most favored one. So it may be rates, it may be FX, it may be commodities. So that's one clear observation. The challenge will be to also keep up the regulatory framework in line with international developments, which keep raining down on us constantly. So that was touched on by various speakers earlier. So that is really the challenge as well, in parallel to building local transaction volumes, which the representatives from OTP and Alfa Bank also touched on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. В нас ще два запитання. На одне я, в принципі, сама скажу відповідь.
We've got two more questions. I can answer one.
На якому ресурсі буде викладена вся локальна документація?
Where would you find all of the documentation of Ukrainian ISD? You will find it for free, and it's going to be a free download in the website of the American U.S. Chamber of Industry and Commerce in the section on Banking and Financial Committee. You will also find it in the NABU website. There's a question for regulators. By law, regulators are supposed to make a list of key provisions of the master agreement, reporting requirements, and clearing of derivatives. What are the plans of the regulators in doing this sort of thing? So, Yaroslav, I think it's a question for you. The drafts are in the making, and implementation is going hard when it comes to 738.
Наразі ми йдемо
Not so long ago. But I would say we have to work within particular time limits, so we're trying to make with the documents that will allow the market to operate completely, and the changes you refer to, I told you the drafts are in the making, so hopefully towards the end of the year we're going to see them. They will be published, and they will be based on comments and feedback collected. Okay, thank you. So towards the year end, we'll see if it's going to happen. There is a question for banks. Are they offering risk hedging in commodity contracts like grain, natural gas, and so on? Is that happening? There is a demand for it from clients, financial institutions. There is a growing interest in that from our side. There are certain limits right now in the legislation on commodity derivatives, but the market itself and regulators increasingly realize the need for that, and there is some work in progress to make sure that over time these derivatives would do better under the currency liberalization and under the attempts we're making jointly with the regulators. So eventually those contracts would be easy to make and easy to honor in this country. So we are on it, and hopefully it's going to be a positive result at the end of the day. I'm surprised to hear that question. You know, over the last 3 years, an expert of my unit was touring the country trying to speak about hedging for commodity markets. We spoke with the clients from agrarian sector, the clients that do natural gas and oil. So that's the stuff that is traded on international exchanges. We used our London office at that time, but over 3 years, we never got a single transaction like that. We hedged CO2 a couple of times, and that was it. So, I don't know, if you have specific questions or requests, then I would address them, because we spent 3 years trying to find a demand. We could offer that, we could do it, but there was no demand. And that's why we never did anything like that. So, if you make an offer, if you tell us what you want, we're going to tell you what we can do. All right. Time is changing, and the agricultural sector, exporters primarily, exporters of agricultural products are changing their minds. I can see there is a growing demand in that sector. Under the Ukrainian legislation, I cannot go ahead and do everything they need. But right now, They can do it in Chicago exchange. They use international infrastructure, but some of them would like to do it inside Ukraine. So I'd like for us to be able to be doing this inside Ukraine, even if it comes to hedging. Maybe at the end of the day, hedging will be done abroad by a particular financial institution, but agricultural exporters and other exporters would do most of the things inside Ukraine before that. So there is a growing demand right now because fluctuations in the commodity markets have become bigger recently, and some of the operators have sustained.
Хочет хеджировать свои риски. Ну а когда будет инструмент, то, конечно, спрос будет ярче. Я в этом уверена.
Ну, мне похоже, как Мойшу, да, Мойша, купи мне лотерейный билет. Когда у тебя нет продукта, они приходят и говорят, дай. Вот я готов дать продукт, вот пусть кто-то придет и мне скажет, я готов купить на 10 миллионов долларов, вот такой-то хедж. Поверьте мне, если вы придете с таким объемом, мы найдем способ, как это сделать на украинском балансе. В Excel.
We're gonna find a way to make it in the Ukrainian balance sheet. I can do this in Excel. There are legislative restrictions for these markets, and we discussed this last week with the experts, but we haven't found any major regulatory problems, by the way. I'd like to add by saying that I have this kind of bridge, I mean the banks, which can help Ukrainian businesses that do not have any way to go to the Chicago exchange. If it's a big agricultural holding, they're going to reach Chicago exchange, but there are smaller clients which cannot do it themselves, and they could get there through the Ukrainian banks. So the Ukrainian banks could help those guys. So if you can see there is a demand in the clients, but something doesn't come from us, I think it all should work out fine, but sometimes something might not go as planned. So if you see something is missing, something gets in the way, let us know about that. If you can see there's a growing demand, but something doesn't happen right, just let us know. We're with you. We are on the same side. That's quite a positive ending to all of this. Well, from the theory and general things, we have seen and heard some statements like, come over, tell us what you want, and we will see what we can do. Well, thank you all very much indeed for this discussion and questions. Hopefully, a few years down the road, we're going to be able to report better progress.